Hey, what's going on, APUSH people? We have Key Concept 6.3 for you today, the revised edition, the most up-to-date Key Concept 6.3 video that you will find. All right, let's get started. So, Key Concept 6.3 states, the Gilded Age produced new cultural and intellectual movements, public reform efforts, and political debates over economic and social policies. So, some big idea questions you can answer by the time you're done with this video are: what were different examples of discrimination that various groups faced in the 19th century? How did business leaders and the wealthy justify their wealth? And how did some in society criticize capitalism, and what were the alternatives they proposed? Okay, let's take a look at Roman numeral 1. It states new cultural and intellectual movements both buttressed, which means provided, and challenged the social order of the Gilded Age. So let's talk about social Darwinism. It's specifically mentioned, you need to know this. This is taking Charles Darwin's ideas of evolution and kind of applying it to humans. And the best example of this is survival of the fittest, which was coined by this dude, Herbert Spencer. And what he argued, and advocates of survival of the fittest, or social Darwinism, argued, is that businesses and people can use any tactics necessary to prosper. So this is where we see the emergence of things like monopolies, vertical and horizontal integration, and pools. And the wealthy said, hey, this is acceptable, this is okay, because we're big and strong and powerful, and we are prospering. So why was it used? Again, this was used to justify the success of the wealthy. That could be a potential multiple choice answer that you could encounter. Why were tactics like social Darwinism used? And again, this states it is appropriate and inevitable for the wealthy to succeed in society. So the gospel of wealth emerges during this time, and this was written by steel tycoon Andrew Carnegie, or Andrew Carnegie. And he argued that the wealthy should give back to society, and that's an example of philanthropy, of giving money away. Currently in the news, you have people like Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, who has pledged to give away 99% of his wealth. That's an example of philanthropy. So some examples of philanthropy: well, Carnegie gave money for hundreds of libraries throughout the United States. People who support the gospel of wealth didn't advocate just going up and giving money to the poor, but rather giving money to community organizations which would benefit society. Cornelius Vanderbilt gave $1 million to help establish Vanderbilt University. So the creation of schools, libraries, and other societal organizations are examples of the gospel of wealth in action. So there are some alternative visions for the U.S. economy and the U.S. society during this time. We have agrarians, people who are farmers. They saw more government involvement in the economy. We saw this with the Populist Party. And they also advocated government ownership of railroads. And we also have people like Coxey's Army. This was a group of people that marched to Washington in 1893 as a result of the Panic of 1893, and they demanded relief in government works programs. They were not accepted. Their ideas were shut down, but we will see what they were calling for is very similar to what FDR provides through New Deal agencies. Utopian societies, we're coming back to them. We talked about them during the time of the Second Great Awakening in antebellum America. An example that's still around at this time is the Oneida community in New York, and they practiced communal ownership where everybody owned the land. They also practice free love and eugenics, which is selective breeding. And that's something that will continue over into the progressive era. They believe they could improve human society by only allowing certain people to procreate. Socialism is an appealing idea during this time. You have people like Eugene V. Debs, who we'll talk about more in the progressive era. They advocated for that the society is more than just the individual, and they help promote human welfare and the elimination of class systems. And Eugene Debs was an advocate of government ownership of railroads, so really limiting the power of these corporate tycoons. And finally, the social gospel. This is a Protestant church movement to improve society. So we see the church getting involved in ways to help improve society. Okay, let's take a look at Roman numeral 2. It states dramatic social changes in the period inspired political debates over citizenship, corruption, and the proper relationship between business and government. Now, the Republicans and the Democrats in the late 19th century, you must know characteristics of them. The Solid South, they will vote Democratic pretty much from the end of the Civil War until the 1960s. The North tended to vote mostly Republican. Now, there were some differences between the two parties, most notably tariffs. Republicans advocated raising tariffs, remember Republicans raise, and Democrats advocated lowering tariffs. Democrats want to see tariffs go down. So that was one issue. The other issue was the currency issue. And in the election of 1896, we see the Republicans, led by William McKinley, they favored the gold standard, or gold backing up the value of the dollar. And the Democrats, led by William Jennings Bryan, who was also the populist candidate, they favored free silver, or allowing silver to back up the value of the dollar as well. And here's an example of the Solid South. You notice it's all blue down here, but ultimately William McKinley prevails and the gold standard leads the way. Reformers argued that greed and self-interest corrupted all levels of government. We see this on the local level and with political machines, especially Tammany Hall in New York City. And on the federal level, you see patronage, in which many government jobs were given based on who you know, and also the election of senators by state legislatures. That will be repealed with the 17th Amendment. But many people argue that state legislatures were corrupt and would elect senators that were favorable to big business. So women during this time, they are seeking greater equality by joining voluntary organizations. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which sought to ban alcohol, and that will play a role in the formation in the 18th Amendment, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association, or the NAWSA, which will play a key role in the formation of the 19th Amendment. Here you see Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, two prominent members of the NAWSA. NAWSA, as I mentioned, helped lead to the passage of the 19th Amendment, which granted women's suffrage. That was in 1920. Going to college, we see the emergence of many women's colleges, although at this time it was mostly seminaries and teaching women how to be housewives. You see women play an active role in promoting social order and political reform. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, again, she was a leading suffragist, and she was also an advocate of interracial marriage. And women would also work in settlement houses. People like Jane Addams, who established the Hull House in Chicago, which helped women, children, and immigrants adapt or assimilate to American society. And this really helped inspire other settlement houses throughout the United States. In 1896, we have the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, one of the worst decisions in Supreme Court case history. In an 8-1 ruling, everybody except this guy, John Marshall Harlan, upheld that racial segregation was okay as long as separate facilities were equal. So he was the one guy who voted against the rest of the Supreme Court justices in Plessy versus Ferguson. Most gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction were severely limited. The 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. You have things like sharecropping, literacy test, poll taxes, the KKK, which really limits the effectiveness of these amendments. And African American reformers continued to fight for political and social equality in the face of many different obstacles, including violence. You have people like Ida B. Wells, who was a journalist that was an outspoken critic of lynching, and she advocated a federal anti-lynching law. She was a very influential journalist from the South during the late early 1900s. You have Booker T. Washington, who advocated vocational training for African Americans and equal economic opportunities. So he helped fight discrimination in the South. And there were scientific theories of race during this time in which some anthropologists argued that African Americans were inferior to whites, and they would use skull measurements and other bogus ideas to justify their beliefs. Okay, let's finish up with some test tips for multiple choice and short answer. Plessy versus Ferguson, know it, as well as the impacts. I didn't mention it, but that will be overturned by Brown versus the Board of Education. Know some alternatives to capitalism and examples of discrimination and how people countered it, whether it was women or African Americans. For essays, you can see an essay comparing forms of discrimination with other time periods. So for example, what were the responses of African Americans in the 1890s to the 1920s, and African Americans in the 1950s and the 1960s civil rights movement. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I do look forward to seeing you back here for 7.1, which we will get into the Great Depression and this New Deal program. Thank you very much for watching. Best of luck on all your tests, especially the one in May, and have a good day.